Hello, I'm Henry Bonsu and this is Doubling Down, where every week we tackle a topic that's got you talking in social media and beyond. Joining me today are the journalist and author Ella Whelan, the author and blogger Richard Phillips, and Sylvie Abwa-Bradwell, the Executive Director of the Policy Centre for African Peoples. Welcome to all of you. Nice to see you. Right, it's the kind of incident that used to dominate the news, but not anymore. Last week, when around 100 people drowned off the coast of Tunisia, there was barely a murmur. It's a silence that has led some to think Europe's immigration crisis is over. Yet although deals struck between the EU and Libya and Turkey have reduced numbers heading from those countries, still they come driven by war, poverty, fear and the hope of a better life. It's a dream that has cost nearly 700 people their lives so far this year. But if they do reach European shores, they face an increasingly hostile welcome. Matteo Salvini, Italy's new interior minister, has even threatened to round up, detain and eventually deport 500,000 illegal immigrants back to the African, Middle Eastern and Asian countries they came from. From Germany to Austria, from Poland to Slovenia, all across the EU, far-right political parties have been voted into government with an expressly anti-immigrant agenda. So where is this all heading? Let's see what the panel thinks. Ella, I'm going to start off with you. When you heard about this latest tragedy off the coast of Tunisia, what was your first thought?
Well, it's terrible, and it really did go unnoticed, and that's a tragedy even in itself. I mean, the fact is we had a kind of spike in the last few years where everyone was talking about it, but this is a problem that has been happening for years.
Yeah.
It's ongoing, and there's no sign of it stopping anytime soon. But if I can say the word that it's a perfect example, it's obviously a terrible example, it's a perfect example of exactly what's going wrong with the immigration crisis in Europe, because it's a problem that doesn't have just one guilty party.
Right.
It's symptomatic of the kind of deeply disorganised, dysfunctional and, you know, ending in tragedy kind of situation we have in Europe in relation to migration.
Well, you've written very critically about this in Spiked Online, your magazine. Are you pointing the finger more at the EU, more at Brussels than anywhere else, or are you also thinking, well, they're doing some dodgy deals with the countries that are exporting these migrants, like Libya, for example?
Well, like I said, I don't think there's any one party to blame, but certainly what the EU is doing is despicable in terms of it's literally kind of greasy-handed, backhanded money to these countries that they call, it's said that it's for development aid, and really it's just payoff to keep black people out of Europe, and you can put it as simply as that. There's a reason why the EU is called kind of Fortress Europe, and the fact that you've got boats now sort of hovering around the North African coast just waiting to pick people up in this very shady, very kind of corrupt looking system going on. And feed into that the fact that the EU now is seeking to kind of moralise to countries within Europe about migration and about what kind of quotas they should have. It's like almost it's like horribly laughable.
Well, this is going to come up later on this month at the European Council in Brussels. So, Richard, is the EU wrong to try to stop the movement of people at source? Because that seems to be the direction of travel at the moment.
Well, I think on a sort of personal basis, I mean, you know, on one level, I kind of believe in free movement of people everywhere, wherever they want to go. But the truth is that what you've got is this is doing, the immigration crisis, as it were, is creating a situation where you have politicians, nationalist politicians, who want to create trouble, able to, you know, to sort of use these dog whistle methods, and they are effective. That's why we've got this, you know, the situation with the far right in Germany, you know, now being in power, you know, well, not in power, but in, you know, in Parliament. The situation in Austria and Italy and wherever else, and of course in Hungary, and
but they were elected in free and fair elections.
But the reason they
were
elected is because it is simple to exploit some people's, you know, fears of otherness, and whether we like it or not, that is a feeling that is prevalent almost everywhere amongst certain groups of people. We see it ourselves. I mean, yesterday, Paul Dacre happily, you know, took himself upstairs, but, you know, and was...
He's the editor-in-chief of the Daily Mail.
Yeah, absolutely. So the problem is here, it seems to me, is that on the one hand, I'm not absolutely sure about in terms of them being despicable. I think that the clear answer is to spend money developing is to spend money in the countries where people come from.
But that's a generational operation. I'm going to move to Sylvie, because the European Union and national governments are trying to stop the pull factors, as they might call it. But what about the push factors? People are leaving some of the poorest countries in the world often because they have a well-founded fear of political, religious, ethnic, or you might even call it economic persecution. Can you understand why people take such great risks, even though every other month there is some kind of tragedy?
Absolutely. Because what is really regrettable about the latest tragedy is that a lot of the people who were drawn were Tunisians. And really, Tunisia is not one of the countries that has been exporting people until recently. So it shows that there is a lack of hope amongst the people, above all the young people. But rather than just blaming Europe, what I would really like to see is an awareness of the fact that a lot of the countries where the young migrants are coming from, there isn't the realization that these are the young people who should be building the countries. Migration should not be an aspiration. It shouldn't really be the way forward for any country. Africa, for example, is full of young people who should really be participating in the building of the continent.
They say they want to. When they're interviewed on these boats, they say, I want to do something with my life. That's why I'm leaving Eritrea or Sudan or Gambia or Niger.
There should be a situation whereby the conditions are there for the young people to participate in their countries, of origin. Now, what we need to do in the context of migration is to change the discourse where we have in place policies that enable a fair exchange of migration. What do I mean by that? That if, for instance, at one stage, people are needed to pick fruits or whatever, there should be the possibility of people coming for 2-3 months and going back with that money and doing something constructive, not just trying to play the blame game.
Yeah. But isn't this, quote Mrs. Thatcher, you can't buck the market. People are doing this because that is fundamentally what they want to do. However much they might think they shouldn't be there, that's where they think there is a better life, or fundamentally, a more comfortable and less oppressive life.
All right, we'll come back to you in just a moment, panel. But we want to move on because the numbers reaching Europe by sea have dropped significantly since the high point in 2014, when 170,000 arrived from Libya alone. EU officials, as we've been discussing, have toyed with all kinds of ideas to keep the numbers down, from doing further deals with countries like Sudan, Eritrea and Lebanon to persuade them to stop irregular migration, through to offering more visas to help people travel legally. One politician deeply involved in this debate is Stephen Woolfe, independent member of the European Parliament for North West England, and he joins us by Skype now. Stephen, thanks very much for joining us. What kind of reaction was there in the European Parliament or among you European politicians to these recent deaths?
Probably two reactions, Henry. The first was for many not to have even noticed it this time round, which is, in a way, as Ellie said, was shocking. But the second reaction was from people like myself who monitor this on a regular basis, is that it was expected. There is no end to the crisis of those people leaving the Middle East, Southern Asia and Africa to come to the European Union. And this will not stop, and you will see more deaths this summer because more people will still come, notwithstanding all the policies and money being spent by the European Union to try and persuade countries to control those people leaving, or in the case of Turkey, to hold them there in their country so that they don't come to Europe.
This is the really hot topic at the moment for the European Union. And I see that a new Italian Interior Minister, Matteo Salvini, has sent a message to illegal migrants, pack your bags. And you've quoted that on your own Twitter feed. Now, why did you feel the need to quote that and put it out among your Twitter followers?
Because I wanted to show people that what is happening in the leadership now of the countries of the European Union is something that I knew was coming, and warned the European Union leadership, even had a very strong debate with Marcus Weber, the head of the EPP in the Parliament, that if they didn't control the numbers coming into the European Union, you would get two things. First of all, you would get more radical views on how you deal with the asylum seeker issue. And secondly, you will get people across the continent no longer feeling concerned about asylum, the deaths of asylum seekers, or even the kind of harm that's happening to them when they get into Europe as well. And I can see both of those happening.
All right. Well, I've got three panellists with me in the studio. We've got Ella Whelan, Richard Phillips and Sylvie Abois-Bradwell. They want to put one or two questions to you. Who wants to go first?
Yeah,
Ella.
well, because the problem with this whole debate is that obviously it gets classified as people who are worried about immigration or want to talk about immigration get called kind of racist. I know that you were part of UKIP, which has had a lot of criticism in relation to its policy on immigration levelled at it. What is the feeling in the European Parliament about there's a kind of contempt for Brexit, there's a contempt for these kind of, as we said, the rise of the far-right groups across Europe? The EU's solution to that seems to be to completely denigrate the democratic process in these countries. I mean, what do they think is the way to deal with this?
Well, there's actually three things occurred. When we first raised the issue that large-scale migration within the European Union and then the issue from outside of the European Union would actually cause more concern with the population, we were greeted with exactly those sort of names you called. And indeed, I myself was called a racist, a xenophobe, and in some cases a fake black, despite the fact that I am mixed race. The second thing is what we've occurred now is that they're starting to echo the same language in the policies and in the speeches. I mentioned Marcus Weber. 2.5 years ago, he would have been saying that it was racist and xenophobic to try and close the borders of Europe. Now he's actively campaigning for more border guards and securities and more money through the multi-financial framework to undertake that. And the third thing that you're finding in the European Parliament now is that those countries that oppose large-scale migration are having their funding cut. 33 billion is being proposed to be cut from Poland and Hungary.
Sylvie, do you want to say something to Steve about this? Because Steve's presenting himself as, I suppose, a canary in the coal mine. I'm warning Europe what could happen if you don't get a grip on this. But some people feel that helps the populace. What do you say, Sylvie?
What I would like to say to Richard is that there should be a discussion that is more honest, not just in terms of seeing migrants as a problem, but we should really think about the causes of this problem. And we have to be honest and recognize that a lot of Europeans and Westerners are really at the sources of the problems. They are doing deals with the corrupt people who are preventing the flourishing of young people all over the world.
But what do you mean by that?
I mean
specifically, what do you mean?
What I mean basically is that nobody leaves their country of origin willingly and happily. It is always because of extreme circumstances. And a lot of the extreme circumstances have been created by the West in collusion with the corrupt and nasty people who are oppressing people all over Africa and other parts of the world.
I don't think that. I mean, it obviously depends on which circumstances you're talking about.
Well,
if we take the Middle East, for instance,
it's certainly not true that people always leave their countries.
The invasion of Iraq has been at the origin of the destruction of that country, and the destruction of Iraq has taken over what happened in Syria. Will never have happened to this extent if that has.
Well, I don't know how. I don't know how.
Richard, what you're saying is and I totally agree with. There's a terrible irony to the fact that you've got Western powers who have caused such horrendous disruption and damage to countries and uprooted citizens in places like the Middle East, and are now shutting their doors to them when they dare to try and seek a better life.
Sorry, I don't accept the fact that the West is exclusively responsible for the situation in Syria. That is absurd.
No one said exclusively, but they played their hand very heavily in the destruction of the
What I'm saying is that the West is creating a lot of the conditions that are pushing people towards migration, and it is a simple statement of facts.
But Richard, your fellow panelists are asking for more honesty.
Well, I think what we've got is a situation. Look, first of all, let me just say this: it isn't Europeans who have a fear of others. Go to South Africa. and see the rejection of Zimbabwe and immigrants there, it isn't just it is not.
I don't think it's a fear of otherness.
It is, of course it is. It is about fear of otherness.
Fear of otherness is another word for kind of racism.
Yes, I agree with you.
No, there's a difference between, there is still a certain degree of racism involved in this debate, but the vast majority of people who are, like people who voted for the 5-star movement, people who voted for other kind of far-right parties, aren't necessarily rabid racists. That's what Stephen was sort of pointing to. It's people who are concerned with immigration. You can make a differentiation between
let me interrupt you. At the core of this, though, is that Europe has presented itself as the enlightened continent, the liberated continent, European values. In the EU Observer, an opinion piece recently suggested letting people drown is not an EU value. Let me go back to Stephen Wolf. Steve, what do you make of this? Because some of our panellists are saying Europe needs to step up and own some of this, not just say we want to keep these people out, but we are responsible for some of the conditions that have led to people coming across the Mediterranean, putting their lives on the line, and it's not enough to put up the drawbridge. You have to do something concrete to help these people.
Well, look, Henry, there is no doubt that the consequences of our foreign policies and wars have led to the uprooting of millions who want to leave their countries and seek a better life, and that is into the European Union. And of course, obviously, to America and Australia and other countries too. There's no doubt that our economic policies, and I've argued strongly for some time, that the policies of the European Union towards particular food products in Africa is making, and medical products, is making a lot of the competitiveness of new businesses difficult in Africa. So those people also want to leave, and that is Sylvie's point. But there's also two other aspects to it, Henry. There's no doubt that the European Union, and I would actually put Britain here quite strongly in this, there is an element of economic colonialism that we have from our own countries seeking to entice the young people, the brightest from those countries, into our own. And if you look at our way that we treated, taken nurses from across the globe in the UK over the past 50 years, we've actually had to have agreements with African and Asian countries to stop taking nurses, hence the reason why we've looked at European Union countries now. So we have an economic colonialism. So is there a responsibility of Europe? Absolutely. Is it totally European? No, Richard is correct in there. But is it all about racism? Absolutely not, because the economic issues that people feel, that's where they feel it first.
All right, Steve, stay there for a moment. Stay there. We'll come back to you a little bit later on. We want to see what people have been saying on social media. There's been a strong reaction. We knew there would be. Let's have a look at Facebook first of all. And Abena Prempe says, I think we should focus on making it so that people don't have to become refugees in the first place. We're spending so much time debating how to treat a symptom of the disease rather than the disease itself. We should also not be labelling economic migrants as refugees. There is a distinction. Then Carol Barnes says, I was watching a 17th century history programme the other night, and they were talking about immigration even then. It's human nature to seek a better life if you are poverty-stricken, fleeing war, or lack security. It's not a problem that can be solved, just a fact of life. And some of you have also been commenting on Twitter, and here's a flavour of what you've been saying. We'll start off with Faten Ben Hamza, who says, 50 people, well, it's now about 100, died on the shores of Tunisia trying to cross the Mediterranean for a more decent life after paying a fortune to be taken on a miserable boat and be treated like garbage. May all leaders understand that no one does this unless out of despair. And then we have this from Ahmed Idris, who says, these are not just numbers, they are people, fathers, mothers, sisters and brothers. Someone's someone, unacceptable. And finally, this tweet from Something Bright, who says, the migrant crisis started by the UK and France's intervention, which turned Libya from a functional state with a working economy into a violent anarchy and refugee gateway. Thanks, Britain. And remember, you too can join the debate on Twitter, Facebook or Instagram by using the handle DoublingDownTV. Richard, you wanted to come in a little bit earlier on. What do you make of what Stephen said there?
Look, I think... my view of this, generally speaking, is this, that there is always the potential for nationalism. And the problem with immigration generally, as a general principle, is that I think when you have a sort of, it's about, to me, the fundamental principle is the comfort of familiarity. That's what people want. And when they see their worlds, as they perceive them to be rapidly changing, they get nervous. And that's part, and I think they've seen this happen very rapidly, obviously in Germany, and it's very easy for nationalists to exploit that. It is racism fundamentally, and I think unfortunately, that is a fact of life. And I think it has to be confronted on a certain level. But the problem is, if I can just finish this, Henry, just very briefly, the problem is this. We've now got a situation where we have a sort of ascendant far right. If something isn't done, if we have a continual influx of immigrants, then the far right is going to become, much more ascendant.
All right.
And that, whether it's democratic or not, is extremely dangerous.
Sylvie, what do you say to that?
And that's the point I am trying to make, that, as you mentioned earlier, there were troubles in South Africa as well. And this is something that people don't talk about, in the sense that the vast majority of migrants are actually within poor countries themselves. It's not the West that takes most migrants. Number one. And number two, I am the first to acknowledge that there are tensions and nationalists are taking advantage of that. But the way forward is not to say, let's try everything we can to let people drown and to let people die. It's to have an honest discussion as to the causes of the migrations of the people and the solutions. And it cannot be just building walls. It cannot be just sending boats to send people back to Libya or elsewhere. What needs to happen is to understand, as Steve was saying earlier, that our own policies here in terms of economics, in terms of how we have dealt with many developing countries, has not enabled them to find outlets for their young people.
Okay.
Full stop.
Ella, yeah?
Yeah, well,
just rounding up.
Absolutely. I think we should have an honest discussion. I think it's dishonest to say that it's all just racism, because it isn't just racism. We need to have an honest discussion about immigration. Part of the problem is we haven't been allowed to have an honest discussion about immigration. Even though we get headlines in newspapers in this country every other week. It's about people's racist tendencies. I mean, you only have to look at the coverage of Brexit. Still, 2 years after the vote, almost, Brexiteers are still being called racist, even though there is absolutely no evidence to show that there's kind of vast amount of racist tendency among people in Britain. Well, not vast, but I mean certainly there's a deep undercurrent. Hang on, the polls show the deep undercurrent. Well, you just have to look at what happened with Windrush, the recent Windrush scandal, in which it was people polled. It showed that 60% of Britons thought that the treatment of the Windrush citizens let me finish, was absolutely appalling, That rose to over 71% in the over 65. So the myth of the old Brexiteer hating black people was totally trashed. Sorry. It's about... You don't have to apologise, because what I'm saying is quite important. It's a discussion about immigration, and a concern about borders is very different to what I think the EU is doing, which is keeping black people out of Europe. Richard, very quickly before I go back to Steve.
I just think that's... Sorry, I'd absolutely flatly disagree with that. I think that of course they're going to respond in that way, because suddenly these are personalised issues. The fact is, the government's response, the hostile climate to immigration, was created by what they saw as a perceived attitude amongst Daily Mail and Daily Telegraph provoked readdership. That's what caused it. So they create this situation, and then we have
a snob, Richard. I'm sorry.
Okay, we're going to have to round up with the panel, and we're going to finish up with Stephen Wolfe, expert on this subject, who is, of course, a Northwest of England member of the European Parliament. Steve, which way is this going to go? We've got a major European Council meeting on the 28th and 29th of June this month. What do you think is critical for them to decide now on the migration from North Africa and the Middle East across the Mediterranean?
I think what's critical now is whether the European Union will actually follow through with those now believing that they have to control the borders more strongly and stringently going forward. Otherwise, if they don't, then you're going to see more fracturing of the countries. You'll see stronger links between Slovenia, Italy, Austria, Poland and Hungary, linking into later on this year in the elections in Sweden and Denmark. And they will see very strong anti-immigrant parties in place. And those people like myself who believe in a managed immigration policy, which is fair, flexible and forward-thinking, will start being pushed to the margins.
All right.
When we have also those like Richard, who believe it's all down to racism and that is because we dislike people. Unless both sides start to change the way they think and accept that people have genuine concerns about their living places, their jobs and their healthcare, and this is not born out of racism, and the European Union decides to treat people fairly, then we're going to get more trouble in the future. All
right, Stephen, thank you very much indeed. Stephen Wolf there joining us. And that's it for this week. Thank you very much also to my studio guests, Sylvie Aboua-Bradwell, Richard Phillips and Ella Whelan, and of course Stephen Wolf, who joined us via Skype. Check out Doubling Down on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for news of next week's topic and to get your views in early. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.